Hi, everyone. We are going to reconvene and begin our final session of this year's D&I short course. And as we have done in years past, we've always liked to, kind of late in the course, take some time to talk about emerging topics and dive deeper into the focal areas of the short course for each year. So let's take a deeper dive into human-centered design for implementation impact. And we have a few, the way that we're going to structure this basically is we have a few questions that have been shared by attendees, and that can kind of seed the discussion, but I think we're hoping that it will just kind of move into organic discussion, and if you all have questions that come up, and we'll take it from there. We're use this in part to learn about what we want to be focusing on in the future. So keep that in mind. All right, so these are a few of the emerging topics that were listed on the post-it notes. So I'm going to just read the first question and hopefully get some reflections from Dr. Lyon and Dr. Proctor on these. So, how do implementation outcomes differ in their priority level for researchers versus practitioners? And what about when implementation outcomes are not enough for funders? They want more health outcomes.
Right. Well, I'll tackle some of them, and then I'll be interested in hearing what my colleague Erin can shed light on as well. First of all, I think rarely are implementation outcomes sufficient for funders. Theoretically, that should be a priority in hybrid 3 designs. But I know that many funding agencies, because at least the NIH is set up around bodily organs and disease, they have a mandate to be sure that the research they invest in has payoff for improving health outcomes in those domains. So I know that this is sometimes particularly frustrating for organizational level researchers who are interested in enhancing leadership, in building nimble, highly functioning organizational cultures and structures. For policy researchers, it's a long reach between studying how to implement a policy or disseminate information about evidence to showing the payoff in individual level health outcomes. So this is a tension that I would suggest that you discuss with program officers, read the fine print. I think we're discovering some creative ways to work around that. I'll be interested in hearing if the Educational Institute has a similar emphasis. And for those of you, I'm sure there are people in the room who have tackled this challenge successfully. I hope we can share those ideas. You want to talk about the sufficiency of implementation outcomes for funders before we address the larger question?
Yeah, I mean, I would, to your sort of specific question or comment about the education space, it's so interesting sort of in different sectors and different research and otherwise spaces, like what sort of bubbles to the top and what gets emphasized. And what's pretty interesting is that the majority of implementation work that goes on in education is focused on coaching as sort of a broad category, but essentially an implementation strategy, and fidelity. And very rarely do other implementation strategies or other implementation outcomes get discussed. That's beginning to change. But there are just sort of a lot of existing norms related to that. And again, norms across sort of all different sectors and different norms, right? And that's totally fine. Education's also playing a little bit of catch up relative to the health space related to all of this and sort of forging its own path as well. with regard to implementation outcomes and their sort of relative importance for practitioners, I mean, one of the things that we always hear about, which totally makes sense, is some version of the notion of appropriateness or contextual fit. And I think so often the sort of questions related to a particular innovation wind up being things that you can trace back to perceptions of contextual appropriateness. How well does this work? Is this going to work in my setting with my constraints? How well is this going to work for my client or patient population? And I think a whole lot of it tends to come from there. And I feel like even though within education there's such a focus, at least within the research community, on fidelity, I would say fidelity is not necessarily a very high priority implementation outcome for most practitioners. Right. And one of the reasons for that is because to actually, at least with some of our complex psychosocial innovations like the psychotherapies that we tend to implement in the mental health space, the evidence-based sort of psychotherapies and whatnot. Part of it is because in order to do fidelity well, it's incredibly resource intensive. And we have multiple papers sort of demonstrating that there isn't necessarily a very strong link between self-reported fidelity and observational fidelity for some of those complicated interventions. And that probably doesn't really motivate a lot of practitioners to spend a lot of time evaluating fidelity because it can be so burdensome for the systems. So I think another thing that is often emphasized among practitioners, I mean, things that are a little bit easier to measure, maybe initial adoption or something like that, things where there might be existing indicators out there that you could pick up rather than having to evaluate them sort of using a completely new set of assessment tools or something like that.
Yeah, and I would build on that by acknowledging that particularly I think the frontline providers are less attuned to cost as a barrier. If the organization is supporting the infrastructure, the training required to enable the delivery of an evidence-based thing, cost is kind of invisible to them. But to senior management, to CFOs, cost is really a major consideration. And sometimes the adoption of interventions will be halted because it's too expensive, even in terms of provider time. So, I think researchers and practitioners, I'm sure we could do a matrix. We could have an elephant in the room, a big elephant, and we ask the practitioners to go grab the leg or the trunk or the part of the elephant that is most relevant to them. I think those kinds of exercises, or even forced choice kinds of exercises, would help us ferret out what are the priorities to different participants in the overall decisions and delivery of evidence-based interventions.
I can maybe offer my perspective as well. I've just finished another round of reviews at the SIHH study section, which is the study section that reviews most of the grants that go in under the DIRH program announcement. And a couple of things, if you read the review criteria closely, and as most of you know, your overall impact score tends to be driven by significance and approach, and I'll focus on the significance criterion. The DIRH PAR has a couple of questions that should be addressed, and they ask reviewers to look at them. Number one is, what is the estimated public health impact of the research? And so if you're focused purely on implementation outcomes, even for an implementation study, I think you have to make some kind of an argument or illustrate how implementation, an effect on implementation outcomes is going to translate to public health impact. and it's not to say that you have to be measuring, mortality and morbidity and things like that in your trials, but at least kind of making a case for the implementation barrier is
Right.
important, and that's why we're focusing on it, and how that's going to translate to public health impact. The second question is, has attention been paid to the resource and cost considerations of the intervention or the implementation strategy? So that fits in with the Enola's outcomes framework, and we see a lot of applications that cost is just not considered, and I think it's one of those things that we're increasingly recognize, through NIH as signaling what they want to see included in applications, as well as activities in the field where there's more integration of health economic research into implementation studies, that this is something that cost really shouldn't be ignored. It doesn't have to be the top priority, but it shouldn't be left out completely.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Andrew, and it also underscores the importance, I think, of looking at the impact of implementation outcomes, either in a correlational matter or, demonstrating that these are essential, and if we don't attain them, then effectiveness will be eroded, care will be slowed, and I think, and I count myself as a major player in this dilemma. I think the implementation science field, it's taken a while for us to get our act together. We had to define the field, we had to develop terminology. We've been very inward focused, and I say I'm a player in that because a lot of my work has been on working toward harmony and clarity of the moving parts, defining things. But we stay there at our own peril. I think we have to show the payoff of learning how to implement in a metric that matters to health system CEOs, that matters to community and public health, that matters to the health and well-being of the groups for whom our intervention things and policies are aimed to benefit. So I'm kind of at a point in my career of being impatient, that we move on and we test the impact of reaching or not reaching implementation outcomes, that we look, so that we can make a case, so that we can demonstrate that indeed, if we don't do this, we can't deliver care well.
One additional thing I just want to say about sponsors is that even though, I made my comment about education sort of not quite being as far along with regard to implementation as the broader sort of healthcare community. One thing, there is such a parallel in terms of, from one of our primary sponsors, the Institute of Education Sciences, that I think totally parallels what Andy was just saying about emphases within grant applications, both in terms of needing to get to actual outcomes beyond implementation outcomes, because implementation outcomes are sort of from the perspective of many sponsors. And I think it's also true for the other primary federal sponsor that at least I send grants to, the National Institute of Mental Health, that you always need to look at those sort of domain specific outcomes, whether it's mental health sort of functioning or symptoms, or whether it's educational attainment, whether it's school attendance or those kinds of things, and a direct parallel with an increasing emphasis on cost, which is actually a requirement for most, to one extent or another, not necessarily cost effectiveness, but at least cost, also a requirement for most Institute of Education Sciences grant applications these days.
Yeah, and I guess one other thought about prioritizing outcomes, it's, I think NIH, I'm sure a lot of us as researchers have become very accustomed to the concept that you have primary outcome, a single primary outcome, and then a set of secondary outcomes. And obviously, as the language denotes, the primary outcome sort of supersedes all the rest. But I think implementation and its complexity makes it difficult to focus on just one outcome. And I think part of that, I'm reflecting on the image that you showed with the elephant and people from different parts of the elephant seeing different things. And I think it might have to do with different stakeholders having different values and outcomes that will be important to different, from different stakeholder perspectives. So having some way of balancing that, and maybe primary outcomes for one stakeholder group, maybe having something that you focus on for each group would make sense. But this is an emerging area. I think, these trying to figure out how all these outcomes relate to one another is challenging, and something that we need to keep thinking about as a field.
Well, and related to outcomes, I also think that as implementation science and also intervention science has become more sophisticated, we actually have been creating probably more protracted logic models as we've been identifying mechanisms of action for implementation strategies, mechanisms of action for interventions. So all of a sudden we have additional sort of stopping points along the way, and a logic chain that makes a lot of sense, and you can measure each of those things, but becomes increasingly difficult to sort of fully validate. I mean, if I'm thinking about a recent project or a project that we're still doing, right? We have our implementation strategies. We have actually multi-step mechanisms through which it operates. We're based on the theory of planned behavior, which states that attitudes, social norms, self-efficacy are predictors, good predictors of intentions to engage in a behavior, and that those intentions are then a predictor of actually engaging in that behavior. And by then, at that point, we've finally gotten to an implementation outcome. And then following an implementation outcome, adoption, delivery of an intervention with fidelity. In this case, we're using trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. Then we have a variety of outcomes relating to trauma cognitions and things like that are mechanisms of action for that intervention, which would then lead to ultimate symptom change and the kinds of things that our sponsor is actually most interested in. So the ways to sort of manage that complexity, recognize it, push the science forward while also creating things that are going to be compelling to sponsors, and also, of course, our community partners who aren't necessarily interested in the nuanced mechanisms that we've really been getting into, is just a persistent tension.
Yeah, Jane.
I think there's a real tension between cost and equity, because I think, for example, in a low resource setting, adoption and implementation may require more coaching, or whatever your implementation strategy is. And at the same time, in reaching a population that is perhaps at lower health literacy, if the intervention may require more sort of patient activation support, for example. So I do feel like we need to make the case that it's not a one-size-fits-all cost or approach, and especially if we're going to consider health equity.
Yeah, and I just want to return to the issue of logic models and mechanisms that Aaron is addressing and that his colleagues are significantly advancing. I think we still have all the work to do in the domain that I'm kind of calling internal to implementation science. We don't understand mechanisms. We need to develop protocols for strategies. We need to understand their usability, their burden. We have so much work to do in our own house, but I think it is to our peril if we don't extend logic models and mechanisms to the links between outcomes. And we therefore can write grant proposals that we can persuade people to come along with us to help shape our designs, help shape our interventions, because we know that attending to that is going to improve their effectiveness, their reach, the equity with which they're delivered. So that's my soapbox right now.
So how do we balance complexity and simplicity in our models? Our logic models tend to be linear. They oversimplify a lot of what we know happens in reality. At the same time, if we had like a system dynamic logic model that was very complex and lots of feedback loops and so on, that has its own problems. So how would you think about that balance?
I think some of the checks to that are at the review process. If we, keep dwelling on the tiny piece and trying to make it more simple and understand it deeper. I've been on study sections where, I've had a colleague reviewer who said, the last thing we need is another grant on X. So I think, we have to be humble and know the environment so that we know, okay, this project may be novel to me. It may be novel to the setting. It may be novel to the supporters. But is it novel to science? And if we've got a pretty good grip on things from previous science, we need to bank on that and move on. I think we need to view other signals such as roadblocks as an indication that, okay, we need to go back. I was talking to somebody about, okay, you learn some things and then you need to go back and you need to redesign or you need to reshape it in some way. But I think we need to keep our eye on the next ball to be addressing and not get mired down. Some of us, I don't know if there's a phenotype for researchers, but we love detail, we love digging deeper. And the thing I love about implementation scientists is, everybody also really cares about making a difference. So I think as individuals, as teams, and as a field, your point about balance is really critical, and it could be a distinguishing feature to our work.
And one thing that makes me think of, many of you have probably heard this quote. I'm a big fan of this quote, the George Box quote, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And all of our models don't necessarily have to be useful for the same purpose. And I think that sometimes incredible complexity can be very useful, especially if there are methods through which that complexity can be evaluated. But if your model is a communication tool primarily, and when you consider your audience for that communication, you might want to anchor on simplicity. That's typically a good way to go when presenting things to grant review panels. It's typically a good way to go, frankly, when presenting to anyone other than your immediate geeky circle of researchers, because simplicity is what carries the day in terms of shifting people's perspectives. And I'm sure there's some caveats on this, but shifting people's perspectives, engaging people in what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it.
George Box, a great UW Badger, by the way.
I see it's Spirit Week too. Some of you are helping with the spirit.
Yeah, Heidi.
I was just going to comment on what Edmund was just talking about, because we were doing this. It's very interesting, actually. It's a D&I specific grant but I think we're the only group of the 5 funded projects that are actually asking implementation questions. It's like a lot of them are not actually, they're actually doing effectiveness sort of research. It's been an interesting process, but one of the things that Edmund and I have realized is that when we're communicating with our team, we talk about things in one way, and then as we started the real world process of trying to enroll the primary care clinics in the project, their eyes just glazed over with the things that we were talking about. So all of our recruitment materials have been revised completely as we've realized that the models are for us, right? The like menu-based tailoring that we're doing is for us. They don't want to see a complex menu. That freaks them out. All we tell them is, we're going to learn about your context, and then we're going to offer you something that is based on what works for you. And we don't even show the picture of the menu anymore. So it's sort of been real world lessons about your user not being you, and how our concept is actually useful for our research team as opposed to the people who were reaching.
I do want to move on to some of these other questions as well. What about speed in our research structures, funders, publishers, IRBs, etc.?
Slow.
No comment.
Yeah, it does seem like speed doesn't necessarily seem to be a priority in a lot of those situations. But it's all relative, right? Even with regard to sponsors. NIH has 3 standard submission windows per year. I keep talking about, the other major sponsor of my research, which is the Institute of Education Sciences, which has 1. They used to have 2. Then they reduced it to 1, in part to limit the number of applications they got because they're under-resourced. So when you think about timelines and just sort of that one piece of what can contribute to 17 plus years and the creation and application implementation of research, there's sometimes it feels like the speed or the 17 years is death by 1,000 paper cuts. But sometimes they're really hefty paper cuts. And there's no easy answers related to some of that. But it is all relative, and it could be slower, those who apply to NIH.
Yeah, I particularly worry about the misfit of submission cycles and the length of review cycles for early career investigators.
Yes.
We have we help equip our PhD students to submit F-31s, R-36s, a variety of dissertation grant mechanisms. And we need those of us who have a voice and have potential to influence this at any way. We had to work really hard to align our internal program milestones. We used to not let people think about a dissertation proposal until they were done with coursework and orals. There's some logic in that, some good reason for that, but it slows. We have structured a slow pace of thinking about the research you want to do through those kind of internal program mechanisms. And then, of course, the NIH, especially in the life of a doctoral student who's trying to get out of there and get a job, the time to prepare, to submit, to have reviewed, really, if you think about it, what is a student supposed to be doing while a review committee is processing their application? And then we're seeing an increasing tendency in review panels to ask for resubmissions of doctoral grants. So there we go, another year. And so I think we need to be sure that the voices of the users of these opportunities are transmitted to program officers as best we can to help them see the misfit. And in this era of electronic submission and review, I really struggle to see the logistical reasons for such a, I used to say, how long does it take them to open a box and decide who should read this? Well, now they don't even have to open the box. So it's the grant review process is really a culprit in contributing to the protractedly long period of time.
Given that misfit and what we know about bureaucracies and federal agencies and the time it takes things to change, it seems futile to wait for that. So, and this is maybe related to the fourth question on here too. And I'm an early career investigator, so this is real for me. And having submitted a federal grant last week, I'm now this week sitting down and thinking about what can I do to actually now do this work while I'm waiting the 18 months for review and then revision and resubmission. So thinking about partnerships and thinking about alternative funding mechanisms. And so would be curious to hear your thoughts based on experience or other people who have had success or where to go looking for other people who may be interested in funding.
Right. Yeah, I think shopping around for foundation support, for support at the community level. And I know that advancement and development offices at universities have multiple priorities. And they have to make a determination as to whom and what they apportion their time. But, wouldn't it be great if students and early career investigators, if there were advancement office, development office people, grant relations offices that specialized in connecting early career investigators, including doctoral students and postdocs, with supplemental funding. And again, I think those of us who are in positions to mentor, who know the mechanisms of university functioning, we need to be listening to our students and early career investigators and trying to find opportunities for them. So good luck.
And with regard to especially community partnerships, I mean, the best community partnerships are independent of grant funding or research funding or anything like that. Sometimes a grant or a project like that can be a good catalyst for something that can then be continued. But when you have strong community partnerships and can be responsive, sometimes when there's no sort of research objective to needs that might emerge from that partnership, then the extent to which you can ultimately include within that partnership some really great research when the time comes and when you have funding to do it can be phenomenal.
Yeah, I think a consideration might be for early stage or pilot research, maybe trying to find local sources of funding and more community based, and then saving the bigger projects for NIH later on down the road. I don't know. I think it's tough for just given the timing involved with NIH grant review to get things started. So you have to wait so long, and the probabilities are uncertain about whether you're actually going to get funded. This is an interesting question. So what do you think are the stakes of putting humans at the center of design? Why do you think HCD has become so prominent now?
I mean, what are the stakes of not putting humans at the center of design? I don't know what else you would put at the center of design. I mean, although there is sort of discussion.
Machine learning is mentioned here.
What's that?
Machine learning is mentioned. This isn't my question. I don't know if the person who raised it can clarify, but yeah.
But there is even because there is always debate within every sort of field and every corner of every field about whether it should be a focus on humans or whether that's actually too limiting. Maybe there's people within the design community who are designing for animals or climate or so. I mean, there's just a lot of different ways to think about it, at least when you get down to sort of explicit semantics and things like that. But why so popular? I mean, I think that's to a certain extent, there have been people or organizations that have done a lot to sort of move versions of design or human-centered design into popular culture. And, you know, some of it originates back with the design firm out of California, IDEO, that sort of pushed a lot of that out. Even sort of the framing of pieces of it. You know, I put up all those different words that can relate to the overall kind of like design processes, right? Human-centered design, user-centered design, human factors engineering, design thinking. Design thinking is a very accessible version of that concept. And I think that even sometimes that as a communication tool can sort of provide better popular uptake of something. And I would credit part of it to that, and essentially the packaging of the idea, and then sort of seeing it pop up in a number of different places that seem really cool and interesting.
Yeah, I might add that I think user-centered design makes a ton of sense to me as an implementation science way of going about things. I reflect back to when I was an undergrad here, I took a junior design course with Dave Gustafson, and so our engineering design course, the course text was Rogers' Diffusion of Innovations. And so we've really been, you know, we struggle with a lot of terminology. We have people coming in from different disciplines. It's a strength of the field of implementation science that there is so much interdisciplinarity. But then I think everyone has to rediscover, like, oh, these are the relevant kind of ideas and principles that really, that we need to be aware of. And so I think maybe it took 17 years for these ideas to become mainstream in implementation science, but that's my take on it anyway. How about this last question is, what are your recommendations on how to leverage or partner with NGOs and social entrepreneurs? And I might add there, entrepreneurs in general and purveyors and other intermediaries. I know, Enola, you've definitely thought a fair amount about this topic.
Yeah, I became interested in purveyors when our School of Social Work, I've long been a proponent of evidence-based practice, but I wasn't on the curriculum committee. And I walked into a faculty meeting in the year 2000, and the major agenda item was voting on whether our school would become an evidence-based, whether our curriculum would become evidence-based and how we could implement. And I thought, this is amazing. So it passed unanimously. It didn't, somebody said, can I still teach this theory? Yes. Our model was one of transparency, that we be transparent with students about the extent to which what we're teaching has evidence, and that we seek always to bring new evidence into our syllabi and to reshape our assignments. So practica is a really important component of social work education. So we partner with agencies. So of course, deciding what to do internally was not sufficient. We had to partner with our agencies around this concept of evidence-based practice. And we had surprising and highly successful receptivity to this notion among agencies. At the level of their commitment to also be transparent with our students about what practices they are delivering and how they chose them, and the extent to which they and the frontline providers are aware of and being receptive to new evidence. The big barrier at the time was how many psychosocial interventions were accessible through purveyors. So several of us decided we wanted to study this purveyor phenomenon, and we leveraged the then SAMHSA repository of evidence-based practices, which had a huge database. They took it down shortly after the presidential election before this past one. And its intent was to let people who entered this accessible database learn about a psychosocial intervention and learn about a purveyor whom they could contact for training. So we surveyed these purveyors. And the most astonishing thing that we found was that we asked, how much does your training cost? The typical answer was, it depends. And it depended often on how much people would pay and the intensity of the training. So purveyors can either be facilitators, and again, this has roots in Rogers, and also in the home extension program from the 1950s and early 60s, where land-grant universities hired people who were really functioning as disseminators to take evidence out to communities and individuals, and they were functioning as purveyors. And so, particularly in psychosocial intervention, I'm not really sure what, we have pharmaceutical reps who used to, always be dragging their briefcases on wheels into physicians' offices, into hospitals, to promote particular brands of drugs. So purveyors are real. It's a real phenomenon. It's one that I don't think we have leveraged in implementation science to figure out, how can we partner with purveyors to make their own training more efficient, more affordable, and more nimble and more successful. And of course, now we don't have the data to even link us to purveyors on a national level.
And I might build on that a little bit. With purveyors and implementation intermediaries really being the purveyors sort of being more often dedicated to a particular innovation versus intermediaries who might not necessarily be wedded to any one intervention. And the sort of growth in those communities and the, I think, sort of appropriate level of professional differentiation that we were arriving at within the implementation space, where we have a critical mass and we have people who are more focused on the practice of implementation and people who are more focused on implementation research. And as we go forward, there's of course just, I think, a lot of importance to be placed on avoiding any ironic replications of research to practice gaps that we've seen in intervention science, as we have these both sort of critically important components of the field. But there's a lot of structural barriers to sort of building that kind of integrated field in some ways. We tried to put together a training grant years ago through the Society for Implementation Research Collaboration that was going to gather training teams that would include implementation researchers and implementation practitioners and a few other folks as well. But we couldn't necessarily get it funded. We went to NIH, and their funding mechanisms were only for researchers, and the only people who could, if other people participated in those training programs, they had to just be there sort of in service of the professional development of the researchers, which felt weird. So we didn't do it. But I mean, this is going to be something that I think increasingly and probably forever, the field of implementation will also need to grapple with. At the CERT conference, there's been a whole lot of effort to create a welcoming space both for the implementation research and the implementation practice communities in order to kind of buffer against some of that inevitable siloing, or maybe it's not inevitable.
And Aaron, have purveyors come to CERC I know they're not a heavy presence at the DNI research conference.
There's
but-
definitely more of a presence at CERC, and it's been
Great.
deliberate to try to invite
Excellent.
purveyors and intermediaries.
Excellent.
Probably more intermediary representation
Yeah.
than
Yeah,
purveyors.
excellent.
We have time for one more question, I think. Anyone want to ask it?
We could, I skipped over, if there's not another question, I promise to be brief. You ask us about entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
And our CTSA DNI group had what I joked was a forced marriage with social entrepreneurship. Brad Evanoff, our then director, whom I adored, said, you know, Washington University has a hefty social entrepreneurship initiative. We also have an implementation science initiative. We will support you if you'll sit down together for a couple of years and figure out what you have in common and what is different. And so we tackled that. It was fascinating. Talk about being bombarded with language, like their group did not understand the language of implementation science, you know, and I'd never been, quote, paid through effort to just sit and talk to somebody I didn't understand. It was magical. I loved it. And who didn't understand me and kept challenging me. But we did find a lot of commonalities, and we found a lot of mutual benefit. And in a paper where we described this initiative, we report how we had a pitch event where we invited implementation researchers who were using our DNI core come pitch their projects to a group of entrepreneurs. And we had a cultural anthropologist who observed and took notes. And, you know, it was astonishing. The entrepreneurs said, well, who really needs this? No, I don't mean depressed people. I mean, how many people in society? And who would pay for this care? And through what mechanisms would we pay for this care? And it was like the implementation science were saying, oh, I don't know. I need to think about that. So there's a lot of opportunity to benefit. And the big takeaway I had was we still, as a field, are so committed to our push out. And the entrepreneurial world asks us to think about the pull for our product. And who will pay for it? Why will they pay for it? And how much will they pay? I think we have a lot to learn at the interface between entrepreneurship and implementation science.
Yeah. I agree, and I'll put in a plug, maybe Jane wants to do it, a plug for the Evidence Implementation Award that we have here at UW-Madison, which is, you know, really about scaling and commercializing interventions that come through research here, and as well as a pipeline program so that we have a focus on finding purveyors and working with purveyors. So this is something that we're definitely tuned into here at UW. Yep.
Yeah, and one of the things you may want to talk about is that the evidence to implementation work, which is looking primarily at complex interventions, and how we can get those, help support those towards scale up, is built on entrepreneurial principles. So who would pay for it? What's the demand? Do you have the cost structure to sustain it? And this year we tried to add equity to it, which creates this bit of contradiction, because some of the most important interventions for equity don't really have an easy answer to who will pay for it.
Yeah.
So if anybody has answers to that.
Yeah, tough question. We might have to leave it till next year. I know Felice wants to wrap us up here, so So thank you for another engaging conversation on emerging topics, and I'll turn it back over to you to wrap things up.